I'm actually, and then I'm going to start this thing that's new for me, which is Zoom Companion,
Okay,
and yeah, that'll allow the editor to follow with the transcript or whatever.
great.
So I thought before we get started, what I do is just give a layout of sort of things I like to cover, and
Sure.
then but let me know if there's things that you think would be important or powerful to include that I haven't thought of.
Okay.
So what I came up with are start off with some memories of your father and his work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Memories of I don't know if you have memories of what life was like before the Salk vaccine got used, what America was like before then. But in any case, how it changed, your sense of how it changed the country,
Mm-hmm.
not just the polio vaccine, but though I guess in particular the polio vaccine, because I think it
Mm-hmm.
was, I don't remember lines outside churches for any of their vaccination. So I think the polio vaccine had a more larger cultural impact than any other vaccine. So how it changed the country. And then I'm also interested in a time when people were eager to get this protection, the
Mm-hmm.
eagerness that was part of the story.
Mm-hmm.
We talk a lot about the anti-vaxxers and our issues with them, but we want to emphasize the fact that vaccines could be something that are a very positive force in people's lives.
Yes.
And that, in fact, in today's parlance, they are congruent with wellness and see vaccinations and wellness in opposition because wellness, in many ways, has an anti-corporate flavor for good reason because corporations promote things like tobacco and environmental poisons.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but vaccines aren't really part of that. They're not part of the tobacco story or the
Mm-hmm.
oil and gas poison story. They're part of the wellness story in many ways.
Yeah.
So those are the things that I had in mind.
Sure. Okay, that's fine. I think we can wind our way through things in whatever thread is seems natural and comfortable.
Okay, and again, thank you so much. I mean, personally, I'll just share with you. I keep 4 of these vials on my desk ever since COVID hit. These are the first vials I used to give people the COVID vaccine when it
Yeah.
first came out. And I think I felt something akin to what people felt when the polio vaccine came out. Um, and as a pediatrician, I had a small practice. I wasn't part of a hospital chain. I owned my little practice, and I decided that the doctor would give the shot. So I gave the kids all the vaccines personally.
That's great.
So I gave untold numbers of IPVs over the 30 or 40
Wow.
years that I was at it.
That's
And so to be able to talk with you and with you in particular, be connected to this great, I don't know, I liken it to the Italian Renaissance, this great flowering of human imagination with enormous impact for humanity.
yeah.
I mean, it means a lot to me personally to be talking with you. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here and to do that.
All right. So I think we'll get started now.
Sure. Good.
All right. So my name is Arthur Lavin. I'd like to welcome everyone to this very special time of interview with Dr. Peter Salk. I am the founder of Grandparents for Vaccines, and I'm a grandparent standing up for grandparents vaccines because I don't want to see my grandchildren suffer the same fate that a lot of people did when I was a kid and before vaccines were available to protect them from really awful things that we have the power to keep them protected from completely today. And I'm excited about inviting Dr. Salk to this interview because he is part of a legacy, really, a story of America in the world in which we confronted humanity, that is, confronted this devilish thing, polio, which caused untold suffering and found a solution. We actually have the power in our hands to eliminate the disease off the planet, and we're not that far away from doing so. And Peter's father, Jonas Salk, who brought the polio vaccine to humanity in its use. So we're very excited about having a chance at Grandparents Vaccines to speak with you today. And would you prefer to be called Dr. Salk or Peter for the duration of the interview?
Let's do Peter. That sounds just fine to me.
Very good. So I think what we'll start with is I'm very excited to hear your recollections of your father and his story, and briefly what his story did for humanity and your memories of it.
Yeah. Let me just say a little bit about my father. He was someone who, as a child, for whatever reason, early on, would pray that he would be able to do something good for humanity. So that was
Mm,
just part of his makeup. And his initial thought had been, well, perhaps he would go into law and help or go to Congress and make laws that would be beneficial for society. And then when he started college, he had the opportunity to take a chemistry class, which was rather a conflict in the sense that it met on Saturdays, and he was brought up in a Jewish family, and that was the Sabbath.
mm,
And he had to make a difficult decision. He chose the chemistry class, and everything else unfolded from there. So that's just to say that he knew even early on that he was attracted to the notion of going into research. And he wanted to have an effect that would be beneficial for people on a large scale. He would chose to go to medical school. He was extremely good as a practitioner. He was skilled and recognized for those skills, but his interest was to move into research. And this all happened at a time when there was sort of an underlying philosophy about vaccines, which is that um, it was known that you could protect against a couple of the detrimental effects of a couple of infectious diseases. This was tetanus and pertussis by taking the toxin that those two that types of bacteria made that caused the damage. And you could take that toxin and change it chemically so it was no longer dangerous, but would be able to be recognized by the immune system as something foreign. And because of if one was immunized with that inactivated chemical preparation, that would take care of preventing the detrimental effects of those infections if one were to happen to get them. So that was known, and those were a couple of bacterial diseases. Um, but the philosophy was, and actually it was interesting because in his first year in medical school, the professor told that story. And then in the next class, told the class, however, when it comes to diseases caused by viruses, let's say influenza, for example, you can't do that because with a viral illness, you have to experience the actual infection by the virus in order to become protected. And my father asked the professor, well, how come? And the professor's answer was basically, well, just because, which left my father feeling not very satisfied and wondering, well, why should that be the case? Why can't we protect against viral illnesses using vaccination procedures based on a killed virus that's inactivated that won't produce any harmful side effects? So that was part of his experience from the first year of medical school on. He had the opportunity to work with a mentor there, Thomas Francis Jr., who was basically interested in the same sort of thing. They did some work while he was still a medical student on um, taking steps towards creating an inactivated influenza vaccine. After my father finished medical school and 2 years of house staff work in a hospital, he then went on, followed Dr. Francis, and they were together in his medical school in New York. Dr. Francis moved to the University of Michigan. My father followed him there and continued then to work with him on what turned out as a product of the group of researchers working together to be the very first vaccine against influenza that was introduced into the armed forces at the end of World War II. Influenza killed more soldiers than did the war effort in World War I, guess it was. So anyway, that's just the background to that story. After the flu vaccine work, my father was developed a hankering to move on into someplace where he was more in charge of what he was going to be doing in terms of research. Ended up going to the University of Pittsburgh, established a research group there. Very quickly was identified by the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis. March of Dimes, the director of research, came, knowing the work that he had already done on the influenza vaccine, inviting him to take part in what the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, otherwise known as the March of Dimes, because of its fundraising efforts, all of this having been created by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had been affected by polio in his own earlier years. So what ended up happening was the development of, first of all, taking part in the National Foundation's typing program, multi-center. There were 4 different research centers involved to determine definitively how many different immunologic types of poliovirus existed.
Yes.
It was already known that there were at least 3 different types. In other words, if you got polio caused by a type 1 virus, you could never get polio caused by a type 1 virus again, but you could get infected and develop paralysis from a type 2 virus or a type 3 virus. So you had, if however many types there were, you'd have to include them all in the vaccine in order to protect against the disease. That program was undertaken. My father did some modifications of the techniques, ended up with results very quickly, more quickly than had been anticipated. In any case, the bottom line turned out to be no, only 3 types of poliovirus. So that's, that's sort of the marching orders for what needs to be done. But again, my father, sorry, was living in a time where the underlying prejudice was, or the dogma, so to speak, was, well, okay, for a viral vaccine, you needed to have a living virus, even though the influenza vaccine was a killed virus. So that had already been demonstrated, but still there was that sort of hurdle to overcome in terms of the prevailing points of view. My father and his very skilled laboratory team at the University of Pittsburgh pursued the killed virus route using actually the same chemical that was used to inactivate the influenza virus in a different, slightly different way, to inactivate the polio virus, taking great care that the procedure was set up in a way that you could be sure at the end of things that you didn't have any live virus left in the vaccine preparation. And that comes with a footnote, which is that in the 1930s, this was now all taking place at the end of the 1940s, beginning of the 1950s. 20 years earlier, there had been a team in New York that had tried to do something similar, taking poliovirus from infected monkey brains and adding this formaldehyde or formalin to kill the virus, but without any of the quantitative controls to be sure that, so it was sort of add, stir, and then inject. So it didn't have the parameters established to make sure that it was safe. So that was the background. My father and his team did develop a way to do this carefully and in a way that would give assurance that the vaccine, if manufactured correctly, and there was a glitch there that came along at one point in all of this, but if manufactured correctly, would be safe and effective. So that's just the background about the thread that led my father into that realm. But just to now step back and provide the background of what was going on in this country, what was going on in the world with respect to poliomyelitis or polio or infantile paralysis, all the same thing called by different names. And this was something that developed over the course of time in an interesting sort of way. I think I find myself telling stories that reach backwards always. And that is that it turns out that polio has been around for thousands of years, but it never had caused massive problems. And the reason for that is that in the context of imperfect sanitation, here's what happens. Poliovirus gets into your mouth, nose, it gets swallowed, primarily grows in the intestinal tract, and gets excreted out the other end. If the sanitation isn't good, then people in the environment can be exposed to polio in the wastewater or polio in completely clean clothing or what have you, like mothers changing diapers, etc. Um, and then what happens in that context, babies would become exposed to polio very early on because the virus was basically ubiquitous in the environment. And the good thing about that is that mothers will have been exposed to the virus, have developed
Mm.
antibodies, and the mothers will transmit those antibodies to the the, the infants, starting in the placenta, well before they're born, and then afterwards in the breast milk. So that would provide protection for a first chunk of time in life. And if a baby was then, or an infant was toddler, whatever, was exposed to polio early on because it was ubiquitous, they would get infected, but they would be protected by their mother's antibodies. So periodically, infections would lead to paralysis, and the paralysis meant what happens with the poliovirus is it it grows in the intestinal tract, gets into the bloodstream, travels in the bloodstream to the brain and the spinal cord, and there it kills some of the nerve cells that control the muscles. And when the nerve cells are killed by the poliovirus in the brain and spinal cord, they can't send signals to the muscles, and you can't move whatever is the affected part of your body. And that could mean you can't move your legs, can't walk, can't move arms. You might not be able to breathe
Mm.
because of the chest muscles and diaphragm being paralyzed. In that case, the only hope is being supported with some external equipment to help you breathe, etc. So that was the background, and that went on for a long time in human history. Then in the 1800s, we started as a species to clean up our environment, begin to clean up our act with good sanitation, et cetera, et cetera. And that led to the following problem, which was that babies no longer would be exposed to the virus early on because it wasn't hanging around everywhere. Somewhere along the line, they would pick up the virus later on after their mother's antibodies had gone away.
My goodness.
And then would end up paralyzed, perhaps fatally so. Um, and it began this then began to occur in the context of epidemics.
I see.
Viruses would come into a community, start to spread. People would be exposed that had not, or no way beyond protection from the mothers who weren't at this point in life getting exposed so frequently anyway. So we ended up with large epidemics that would strike without warning. They would come primarily during the summertime. You wouldn't know where the next outbreak was going to be, who would be affected, and so on. It was absolutely terrifying. I mean, at the peak of the situation in the United States, this was in 1952. The largest outbreak here in this country was about 58,000
Mhm.
children, primarily children, who were affected. I think there were about 21,000 that were significantly affected with paralysis or death and so on. Parents were terrified. Summer would come, kids couldn't go swimming. They were afraid of being exposed in the swimming pools. Movie theaters would close, etc. It was just amusement parks. It was having just a huge impact on life, and people were terrified. The March of the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis took this problem on, funded treatment, rehabilitation programs, funded research into vaccines, etc. And then, and what ended up happening was that they had their March of Dimes fundraising program, which was aimed at just the common person on the street, people going around collecting from homes, etc. it ended up raising the funds that led to the development of this vaccine. There were something on the order of 100 million Americans that contributed to the March of Dimes campaign. And that was out of a total population of somewhere on the order of, let's say, 160 million people. So somewhere in the about 2/3 of the people in this country, with all counting all ages, contributed. When it turned out that the vaccine that had been being worked on was effective, and it was rather dramatic the way that happened. The work started in Pittsburgh, laboratory animals, success, apparent success in those model systems, moving into children in the area, first at the Watson Home for Crippled Children, just outside of Pittsburgh, where there were kids who had already had polio, where therefore some additional built-in protection against the looking at an experimental vaccine, another institution. Then after those first results were very encouraging in terms of the antibody responses, indicating the development of protection in the bloodstream, meaning if you have antibodies in the bloodstream, virus grows in the intestines, needs to move through the bloodstream to get to the brain. Antibodies in the bloodstream, virus gets in the bloodstream and gets neutralized. So that's where the protection comes in. Anyway, that initial work was, after the initial promising results, there were something on the order of perhaps 10,000 children in the school system in Pittsburgh who served as the next phase of developing the necessary data to move into a very large scale national trial that included 1.8 million children throughout the country. This was the largest such clinical trial that's ever been undertaken. It took a year from the start of that trial until the results were all tabulated by, little footnote, who was in charge of the tabulation? Thomas Francis Jr., the person that my father had worked with in medical school and on the flu vaccine at the University of Michigan. And actually, the Vaccine Evaluation Center ended up being constructed in the hospital where I was born. It was the maternity hospital at the University of Michigan. And so I had an unknown personal connection to that part of the process. Finally, a year later, on April 12th, Tommy Francis kept the results completely quiet. Didn't want anybody knowing about anything ahead of time, including my father, who learned the results at breakfast the day of that Francis announced them, that the vaccine was safe, effective, and potent, with up to 80 to 90% effective, safe, and that was announced at a press conference at the University of Michigan. And I mean, this caused jubilation on the part of the people in the country. It was immediately on the wires and the newspapers and so on and so forth. The way I've heard it is, schools were closed, children were let out, church bells rang, factory whistles blew, etc. This was something that was just such a huge relief of fear. And the people of the country, this was not the way things are now. This wasn't funded by the National Institutes of Health. This was funded by the people of this country giving their money for the program. So this was the people's victory over this disease. I think I'll stop there in terms of this long little narrative, but that sort of gives an overview of. I'll add one other thing, which is that I'll keep it simple for the moment. After the vaccine was introduced, and another parenthesis there, the government approved its use that same evening after the announcements. I mean, it's just the contrast of how things work today. Immediately the polio incidence began to fall, and within within 6 to 7 summers, the incidence of polio in this country had been reduced by around 97%. So this was had such an effect on the people. Experience to be a parent or even a grandparent at that time was had been so terrifying, and to have that fear lifted had just an enormous transformative effect on people. So that in a way, I think it's good to remember how something like that unfolded in the not that distant past, because we saw things like that today with recently with COVID. There've been influenza epidemics and so on, but this was a disease that was so frightening and affecting primarily children, young children, that it just seared through the countries. You couldn't ignore it in a way, and I think having this as a memory that we carry today in the face of concerns and worries about safety of vaccines and so on. There's lots that can be said about all of that. Still, it's good to be able to reach back and touch on this collective memory that still is with those of us who are now at the ages that we are.
So will always be grateful for you sharing these stories. I'm very moved by the fact that your father, who really helped save the country from this fate, was originally and throughout his life motivated by devotion to helping humanity. So it wasn't just lab science. I shouldn't say just, because it was through lab science that the redemption occurred, but his energy was motivated by helping humanity. The other thing I learned from your stories is that there was a time when the country was united in the face of danger. So that, not always, would one story generate a counter story. Although I have learned since that there were efforts to discredit the polio vaccine, even in the early days. Walter Winchell apparently wrote columns against it, and something like 100,000 parents withheld the vaccine from their children. But by and large, to hear that 100 million people donated to this, 2/3 of the country rose up to say, not, I want this danger to be removed from my child's life,
Yeah.
is an inspiration for us today. We are the same people. We are not that different people than the people who lived in the 1950s. In fact, many people we know were alive at that time, and all our parents were alive at that time. And so that's one of the ideas that Grandparents Vaccines hopes to inspire through stories such as yours, Peter, that when our children or our grandchildren face the danger of permanent paralysis, the country showed itself able to unify and save the children.
Yes.
And yes, there were doubts. Yes, there were questions. And there were people who, through fear of vaccination, denied their children this protection. But the overwhelming conversation of the country at that time was, we're not going to let fear defeat us. We're going to embrace saving our children. That will be the dominant theme that we go forward with. And to think about a time when a vaccine was introduced and people rang the church bells and closed the schools and factory whistles blew. I would love to see America be that land again where we celebrate saving our children from fate such as this. And we know, for instance, that polio virus, although vanquished largely, hasn't gone away. And if we stop using polio vaccine, the virus exists enough that it could come back.
Yes.
And it's hard to imagine what your father would say if he surveyed our landscape today and saw people actually opening the door and inviting polio back into our lives. But that's why the grandparents are rising up and saying, we don't want this to happen to our grandchildren. I think, one of the things that is different about vaccines in your father's day and our day is that church bells rang when they were developed back then. now there's questions about science. People aren't so sure science is on their side. And there are aspects, I suppose, of modern technology that have perhaps caused harm to us. But vaccines really are a friend to wellness. They're not in opposition to that. And I know that you've had, in your own life, a devotion to seeking wellness and promoting that for people. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on today's moment where so many people feel as though vaccines somehow are part of a movement that threatens us, when in fact, they fit right in with all other wellness techniques that promote well-being and health.
Yeah. Well, I think that it's understandable in a number of ways that the world is a different place now. Parents are growing up having children born in a time when there aren't, for the most part, the same plague of illnesses circulating that had been experienced for so many years in the past. And that's because of vaccines. Vaccines have eliminated the threat and fear of other diseases, such as measles, which may sound like an innocuous disease. Oh, you get a little rash. It's not that at all. This can be a hugely serious disease, can lead to death, nervous system damage, et cetera, et cetera. Um, Whooping cough, a terrible disease one doesn't want to get. I mean, there's so many diseases that we now have been protected against that it's just not part of our common experience as parents to be, to be concerned about. And as you said, as different vaccines have come along, as with other medications designed to help people, there are times when there can be unintended side effects. And that's been part of the picture. And one has to really, at times, evaluate things carefully. Do I want my child exposed to a potential negative effect or not? And I think in a way it depends, I think, a lot on a person's background, experience, what they're aware of in terms of the environment. And I know for myself, when our son was young, and the question was, well, what does one do about the diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis vaccine? Because at that point, the pertussis or whooping cough component of the vaccine was rather crude in the sense of being a messy preparation of the whole bacterial preparation, as opposed to just the exquisitely selected materials that were the sole ones really necessary to induce immunity. And it could have some significant side effects with high fevers, seizures, etc. It's not frequent, but there they were. And so as a parent, I know I had to consider, well, what do we do here? Um, in a way, because the disease hasn't had at that point not been very prevalent, there wasn't so much risk of getting it because of the vaccines. Would it be better just not to avoid the vaccine because it's not, it's maybe more dangerous to take the vaccine in this context than not to take it right at that point. And all I can say is that everybody's going to be different when they make that choice and that evaluation. All I knew for myself was I'm a physician. Um, we can't do that. I don't want to take a free ride. In order to keep the level of protection up against whooping cough in the population, we've got to continue to be vaccinated. And so I can't not see not having our son included as part of that and depending on other people to protect us, so to speak. So that was other people might make the decision differently, but that was just the way I experienced it. And in fact, he did have high fevers. It didn't lead to anything that was serious or detrimental, but he was very uncomfortable as a result. Did I make the wrong decision? No, I don't think so. I think that we, as a society, it's really important to be thinking not only about our own particular little situation in the context of, well, what's the trade-offs here, but also just to keep in mind that we're all part of this and everyone contributing to this protection of the society as a whole, other children who may not be able to become vaccinated because they've had cancer and their immune system is not working or what have you. There are other people around that can't be protected themselves, and they depend on protection that other people, will give. So anyway, that's my own little wandering through some of these considerations.
Such helpful commentary. It brings to mind the idea that there's one experiment your father never performed, actually. I can't imagine he would ever want to. So he did the experiment to see did his preparation of the vaccine vanquish polio? And the answer was yes. And it did. As you said, it reduced the incidence 97% within a few years and eliminated polio from the Western Hemisphere not long thereafter. Although it still exists in other parts of the world, and the virus has been identified in surveillance systems in the United States recently.
Mhm.
The experiment he didn't undertake, and I'm glad he didn't, was to say, okay, if we get rid of polio, what if we in 10 years stop using the polio vaccine and let the virus come back? What would happen then? And unfortunately, that's an experiment that we're undertaking right now. So that's why grandparents vaccine has formed. We have the memory. There's people in the grandparents vaccines community. We're going to be inviting our audience, those who have stories, to share them with us at grandparentsforvaccines.com. But I know of people in the grandparents vaccines community who had polio when they were 6 years old, took care of people who had polio when they were nurses. And so we are not happy about this experiment taking place of saying, gee, I wonder what would happen if we stopped giving vaccines. How bad could it get? And I think your point is so powerful, Peter, that if we have no memory of these things and no feeling for the devastation that a lifetime of paralysis, being unable to walk, maybe even breathe the rest of your life on your own, if we're unaware of those things, we're a little more open to that experiment of, gee, I wonder what would happen if we stopped giving vaccines. But the grandparents of America know better because we lived through this. And it's why your father never even dream of even asking the question, what would it be like without the vaccine? So this conversation is so helpful because it brings a message to the parents of America who are really making the decisions about whether to immunize their kids, what life was like before the vaccine was available, what impact your father had, the jubilation of a country being rescued from a devastation, and the very frightening prospect that we're placing ourselves in danger to the point we're going to have to suffer again through these epidemics and have the church bells peal again when we come to our senses. Maybe the grandparents of America can help the whole country change the conversation and skip that whole phase and come back to the door being closed. We closed the door on polio and measles, meningitis, and many other killers. Let's keep the door closed. And to that end, we're going to invite everyone listening to this interview to go to grandparentsforvaccines.com, join our efforts. Whether you're a grandparent or not, you're welcome. Our message is we are there for grandparents and everyone who cares for our grandchildren. So that's everyone, I hope. And if you are a grandparent with your own stories or memories of your uncles or other family members who've gone through these experiences, or if you're a younger person whose grandparents shared stories with you, there's a place on our website to share your story. We'll be collecting these nationally. Our launch date is Grandparents' Day, September 7th, 2025. And I want to thank you again, Peter, for helping us do this launch. I think it will help make this a historic effort. Thank you very much.
You are very welcome. It's a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you. I'm going to see if I can.
And we can